So my name is Chris Menapace. I am the Vice President of the Wallingford Historic Preservation Trust, and I'm here to talk to you about the history of enslavement in Wallingford, specifically about one of the projects Wallingford Historic Preservation Trust is pretty much just finished up. I'll tell you about that right now. So in the summer of 2020, the trust began a project that was going to examine the history of the enslaved population of Greater Wallingford, Meriden, and Cheshire, because it is often an overlooked part of the town's history. And so after about 2 years, we've pretty much wrapped up that research, and we're opening an exhibit on June 19th, so a little less than a month away, as part of the 350+2 Wallingford celebration. So, this project involved a lot of research looking at historic books, looking at census documents, land records, military pensions, wills, and many other kinds of documents. So if you were ever in the town's clerk's office, you probably saw me there quite a lot. So today I'm going to give you kind of a sampling of what this exhibit is going to talk about. When looking at the history of enslavement in Wallingford, to get a larger idea of the history of slavery in Connecticut, as well as the town over that history, we were able to find over 400 data points for individuals enslaved in Wallingford, Cheshire, and Meriden. Now, that's just what we were able to find. When looking at the history of enslavement in any community, there's going to be far more that you will not be able to find. And I'll talk a little bit about why. The records I was able to pull showed enslavement from 1706 to 1845. It's supposed to be 45. So over almost 150 years of history of enslavement in Wallingford. And as I'll show you a little bit later, this history has ties to the present in physical structures and lasting legacies. But rather than beginning in Wallingford, I think it's best to begin in Africa. So the slave trade throughout its entire hundreds of years of history began with the kidnapping of 12 million Africans, 3 million of which did not survive the Middle Passage. And you can see on this graph here all the places that it went to. And if you notice, North America, the United States is a tiny, tiny fraction of where enslaved people went. Only about 400,000 of the 12 million victims of the slave trade came to the United States, and an even smaller number came to Connecticut. So the slave trade was designed to dehumanize, to destroy identity and turn human beings into property. And so when we pick up the story in Wallingford, a lot of this has already happened. Africans were not allowed to speak their own languages, practice their own religion, continue to follow their culture, and were often forced to take new names. Some parts of African culture did survive and blend together and create what we would call African American culture today. And so you see a map of Africa before colonization to just get a rough estimate of some of the cultures, mainly West African cultures, where many of the enslaved people were taken from. So before they came to Wallingford, the Africans who were kidnapped had their own identities. They were, of course, very different, each individual person. Some of their identities included being fathers, mothers, husbands, wives, sons, daughters, blacksmiths, warriors, intelligent people, charismatic, tall, short, old, and young. All of these things made up who they were beyond their kidnapping, and when we talk about Wallingford, beyond their enslavement. And this was true, as I mentioned, of all the people that were born into slavery in Wallingford as well. Enslavement was the condition they were put into, not the end all be all of who they were as a person. And so that's something I try to show not only in the presentation, but in the exhibit that's opening up next month. One example is Catham. Catham was born in West Africa around 1750. When he was 5 years old, he was taken, kidnapped by a group of men, and they said they would give him his freedom if he would bring his friend Cato back to them. Of course, when he did return with Cato, those men kidnapped both of them and brought them across the Atlantic Ocean. During this, Catham, in protest and fearing for his life, decided to try to starve himself on this middle passage. And I like to put a lot of the evidence of what I'm saying up on here when I can. So this is a article from the Record Journal from 1900 talking about Catham. So newspapers are a pretty great source that I've been able to use to get this information. And we'll pick up Catham's story throughout the presentation here. But just because only 400,000 people were taken from Africa to the United States and even fewer to Connecticut didn't mean that the slave trade was not an essential part of Connecticut's story and Connecticut's economy. The main two ports were Middletown and New London. That is where most of the enslaved people would be coming. And most of the time, like with Catham, they'd be brought from Africa to the Caribbean, and whoever wasn't sold in the Caribbean would then be brought up to places like Connecticut. And if you're familiar with this history, you'll know that the Middlesex Historical Society did a very large project on this in 2016. And here are some of the log books that are posted online from this exhibit they did, looking at the city's history of connection to the slave trade. And Wallingford was not immune from that history. Connecticut in general supplied many of the crews, many of the captains, and many of the ships for the slave trade. From Wallingford, the two most important people involved in this were David and Phineas Cook. David was the father who owned most of the ships, or owned all the ships, and his son Phineas was one of his captains. One of the stories that you find looking through Wallingford's history of enslavement and the slave trade is this one, where in 1755, while in the Caribbean, Phineas kidnapped a free man named Joseph Demink. Now, the records differ of whether he was biracial or potentially entirely white. But the reality is David and Phineas kidnapped Joseph Demink illegally and sold him as a Black slave here in Connecticut. Now, after 2 years of enslavement, Joseph was able to petition the General Assembly of Connecticut and win his freedom as he was a citizen of Portugal. And so this was a pretty big news story, not just for Wallingford, but for Connecticut in general in that time. And this runaway ad that's right here next to him is of David Cook. So this is 1761, so a few years later. For Connecticut slavery, it began actually pretty early, 1637, with the first enslaved people in Connecticut actually being Pequots that were kidnapped after the Pequot War. But most of them were actually sold down to the Caribbean in return for Black slaves. In 1774, Connecticut reaches its highest total of enslaved people with over 5,000 people enslaved in Connecticut. By 1784, Connecticut passes gradual emancipation. What this means is if the law goes into effect, anyone born after that law took effect was freed at the age of 21. So if someone was born in 1783, they would still be enslaved for the rest of their life. And if somebody born in 1785, they'd be freed at 21. But if they had any children before that time, they would still be enslaved until 21. That is why slavery in Connecticut continues until the 1840s, with about a dozen enslaved people still remaining when Connecticut finally decides to abolish slavery entirely, only 13 years before the start of the Civil War. So the earliest record I was able to find, and I'm going to say that a lot, I was able to find, because if anyone decides to take up this research, I would be surprised if no one's going to be able to find a record before 1706. I really don't believe that's the beginning of slavery in Wallingford. That is just the earliest record I could find. And that was a man named Abijah Prince, who was enslaved by Reverend Benjamin Doolittle. Now, while Connecticut's slavery seems to have peaked in 1775, Wallingford seemed to have peaked in 1762 with about 182 people enslaved in the town. That is just for that year. Of course, that means there were probably a couple thousand enslaved over the almost 150-year history of Wallingford, of slavery in Wallingford. And the last enslaver was a man named J. Parker. So you can see that 1706 to 1848 range. And really the most prolific enslavers in Wallingford were ones with pretty big names: Yale, Hall, Hugh. All of these people, as you can see them listed below, were considered large enslavers for Connecticut standards. Now, when I say Connecticut slavery standards, it's because slavery in Connecticut and slavery in Wallingford looked completely different from slavery in the South. It does not mean to say that it was better or not as bad, just different. For example, the largest enslavers in Wallingford that I was able to find enslaved maybe 8 to 10 individuals rather than hundreds of individuals. And they were not relegated to a specific role. They were not relegated to farming only or housekeeping only. They were anything that the enslaver decided for them to do at that moment or that time. And so an enslaved person could be expected to do any number of tasks, and this labor was incredibly harsh on them. One of the parts of my research was to look at how this labor took a toll on Black bodies. Now, in New York City, when they do tons of renovations, they've come across a couple mass graves of enslaved people, and they looked at the bones of these individuals, and by looking at the bones, they can tell who has arthritis, and by where they have arthritis, what kind of jobs they were doing. You know, if the arthritis was in the hip or the knees or the neck or the shoulders. And they found that people very young adults enslaved in the North were getting arthritis, meaning that their labor was very harsh, very hard labor, even up here in Connecticut. And even then, one similarity between the North and the South when it came to enslavement was these Black codes, Black laws that determined what a Black man, woman, or child could do in Connecticut, whether free or enslaved. And some examples of these: New London passed a law in the early 1700s that the town needed to give express permission for any Black man to own property in New London. One of the most difficult things when doing research on this is trying to do any sort of genealogy. Now, there are a couple examples I was able to find and connect with modern day descendants of people enslaved in Wallingford, but most enslaved people did not have a family name until after they had gained their freedom. And they would often, once they gained their freedom, adopt very similar names: Freeman, Liberty, Freedom, for example. Some of the families I was able to find a lot about: the Freemans, the Prinns, the Naymans, and the Smiths. And these Black communities were very close-knit, especially after freedom was gained. Some of them stayed in Wallingford, some of them moved. One of the pieces of research, another historian was able to find a community in Southington called the Birches, of a Black community in Southington that was very connected, and the Prinns were there, the Naymans were there, the Freemans were there, so it was very connected. One of the interesting stories is a man named Dick Bristol. He was enslaved in Cheshire until 1781, and he was able to gain his freedom after he served 3 years in the military during the American Revolution. And this was one of the common paths to freedom, was serving in the Continental Army. Dick was married Rhoda, who was actually an enslaved Native American woman. Now, what's interesting about that is that she was illegally enslaved by a man named Joseph Hall. Dick and Rhoda had 4 children: Lily, Hampton, George, and Peter. Because Rhoda was illegally enslaved, by law, her children should have been free as well, because enslavement, North and South, followed the mother. If your mother was free, you were free. If your mother was enslaved, you were enslaved. It did not matter the status of the father. So Rhoda was born free, but she was not living free. In 1791, 5 armed white men led by Roger Riley entered Rhoda and Dick's home and kidnapped 2 of her children, Lily and George, for the purpose of enslaving them. In 1792, 3 Black men, Philip, who was a free man, Joseph Prynne, who was enslaved by John Webb, and Jack, who was enslaved by Moses Rice, armed themselves and successfully rescued Lily and George. Now, all of this is happening under the shadow of a lawsuit. Rhoda, is suing because she has been illegally enslaved, and not only trying to win her own freedom, but also the freedom of her children. So even though her husband is free, under the law at that point, she and her children are not. Now, she does eventually win that lawsuit, but it takes years. So during that time, she still has to live as an enslaved person. And this is a primary source, a letter from the Connecticut State Library describing this kidnapping. And unlike that story of Joseph Demink, this was not a well-known story. This was not something publicized in newspapers or in any newspaper I was able to find. This was, not sure why, but it's kind of kept out of the limelight. Now, when looking at the enslavers themselves of Wallingford, it's more than complicity with slavery. Most of Wallingford's most prominent families were enslavers. The Yale family, I've already mentioned one Yale member, but the Yale family, Noah Yale was an enslaver that would live eventually in a place that would become Meriden. It was not separated from Wallingford yet. And one of his enslaved men was Catham, the same Catham I talked about earlier. And also Catham's wife was enslaved by Noah Yale, Maria, and their son, Jude. And here's a runaway slave ad by Elihu Yale. And that's one of those key resources the newspapers are helpful with, is looking at these many runaway slave ads. The wealthier the family was, the more likely they were to be an enslaver. One of these families were the Brockets. When Mary Brocket died, she and her husband, Titus, donated items, money, and property to the Anglican Church, St. Paul's of Wallingford, which is still around today. Mary also freed her 2 enslaved people, Grace and Esau, when she died in 1777. And this wealth that the Brockets were able to achieve to afford things like a silver chalice donated to St. Paul's in 1764, that's still at the property of the church. This wealth was gained in part due to the labor of enslaved people. And so that's one of the things we like to concentrate on looking at this story, is the wealth that's continually built over generations of time in Wallingford, Meriden, and Cheshire by the enslaved population. So when most people think of slavery, they think of farm labor, but one of the most common jobs that was an enslaver was a preacher, a reverend. And one example is Reverend Samuel Andrews. He was a native of Wallingford and a rector at the Anglican Church, St. Paul's. And he was actually a prominent Tory, which led to his house arrest during the American Revolution. But he was far from the only reverend in the town of Wallingford that was an enslaver. In fact, James Dana, who later became an abolitionist and preached against the slave trade, he too was still an enslaver. And this is a record, I'm sure it's hard to read. All these documents, I can tell you, are pretty hard to read. From 1770, July 14th, 1770, it's a burial record of a woman named Dinah, who was servant, as you can see there, to James Dana. And she died at the age of 15. Oftentimes, the records this early on are actually kept by the churches, not by the town. So if you ever decide to do any research into this time period, at this point now, they're probably the state library owns them rather than the town itself. And the 1800s, people like to look at Connecticut and think that we were an abolitionist state. Now, I just gave these examples of the 1700s of slavery in the town. It continued into the 1800s when there were some abolitionist voices, but there were also anti-abolitionist voices. And in Meriden in 1837, this is really the beginning of abolition, is the 1830s. The meeting of a newly founded anti-slavery society in town was attacked by a white mob. They were in the basement of Center's Congregational Church in Meriden, which still stands today. Their locked doors were battered down, and members were hit with eggs and rocks thrown by this anti-abolitionist mob. So you didn't have to be an enslaver yourself to be in support of slavery. You know, when we looked at the slave trade, many of those people involved in the slave trade might not have even owned any enslaved people themselves, or maybe they were just profiting off of the slave trade in general. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of locations still exist today in the towns. Because there's such a long history of slavery in Wallingford, you can see going through town evidence of this. Places that were built, whether through the wealth or the actual labor of enslaved people. So there's Summer Street Cemetery. You'll find a number of enslavers buried there. You will not find any gravestones for enslaved people. I'll go back for a second. This record of a burial of Dinah, servant of James Dana, she was buried at Center Street Cemetery, but who's going to pay for the gravestone of an enslaved woman? Not very many people would be willing to do that in that time period. So you will not find any gravestones to any enslaved people in Center Street Cemetery, but they were buried there, hundreds of them. And this is not unique to Wallingford. Now, I'm going to show you some places that are around today, but keep in mind these are still places being used by people, whether it's their people are living there, they worship there, or they're burying people there. So this is First Congregational Church in Cheshire. And in 1830, census shows Jerusha Bandon as enslaving 2 people. And he was a member of this church. In fact, one of the bits of research I found is another historian was able to find slave pews still in existence at the Cheshire First Congregational Church. So when enslaved people would worship in churches in Connecticut and Wallingford, they were segregated. They were not allowed to sit with the white members of the congregation. And so those were labeled slave pews. So even the free population of these towns, the free Black population, were expected to sit in these pews. And as I mentioned, some of them still exist today. I don't believe Cheshire is using those pews anymore, but they do still exist. This is the Atwater Cottage. And in the 1800 census of Wallingford, Caleb Atwater, who this was his general store, is listed as having one enslaved person. This is the record here at the bottom. There would be a title at the top listing, male, female, ages, and then all the way to the right, enslaved people. So he had at least one enslaved person, 100. So this being his general store, many of the goods, what are the crops or gunpowder or whatever, when he was known to sell gunpowder, these products were made by slave labor, or at least in part. Oops. And we have the Theophilus Jones house here, and here is a runaway slave record from 1795. And I'll read this one. Runaway from the subscriber, the 8th instance, 2 Black boys, one named Alexander, 19 years old, tall, and I can't tell what that is. Thin face, squint-eyed, all of these details about him. We only get a partial picture into the lives of many of these enslaved people because there's no follow-up to say, well, did Theophilus Jones ever catch Alexander or Robert? We have no idea. Most of these never have any sort of second record, although there are some instances for other towns. When I did some research in Farmington, of 4 different records for the same person over almost 2 decades, showing that he was recaptured and then continued to run away. And runaway was the most common form of resistance, or at least the one people know most about. The Underground Railroad does not really exist for example, this record, 1803. It's a very informal network. It ran through Connecticut, but these are people enslaved in Connecticut. And so resistance took many forms. The one we have the most evidence of, as I mentioned, is enslavement. So there's 1803, a woman named Betty runs away. She was about 19 years old, living in Wallingford, enslaved by a man named James Armour. This one, 1759, runaway from Joseph Hall, a mulatto slave, so a biracial individual named Caesar, about 26 years old. This one, Cuff, 23 years old, running away from Charles Hull in 1791. A Black girl named Jin, about 24, 25 years old in 1787, fleeing from Elijah Scoville. This is another one where someone has actually been captured and is looking for the person who picked them up, person who will take them back to enslavement. So Jack says he was enslaved by Nathaniel Curtis of Wallingford in 1759. Another one for Joseph Hall, Elijah Parker, and there's more and more, John Hall, and tons of these records of people who had escaped from enslavement. And we only have some of the newspapers from this time period. So one of the things I want to make sure I get across is that this is just the tip of the iceberg when we look at Wallingford's history, or really just enslavement in the North in general. We're only getting bits and pieces here and there of these people's stories, and only a fraction of really the scope of enslavement in the North. Yeah.
I have a question. Two of the ads said anyone that harbored a slave would be punished by the extent or by the peril of the law. Do we know what that Farrow was, or, what the repercussions of harboring the slave?
Yeah, so the first runaway slave ad is signed by George Washington when he's president in, the 18th century. So I don't think there was a written formal punishment in the way that there was a certain prescription for what that punishment would mean, but it would mean legal consequences for that individual who would harbor somebody who had escaped. And as you were mentioning right there at the bottom, all persons are forbidden to harbor or employ said boy at the peril of the law. That's 1796. And of course, these restrictions get worse as there are more runaway slave ads passed, the most famous of which being in 1850, after slavery is finished in Connecticut. This is an oral history of another form of resistance in Wallingford. So this came from a book, A Century of Meriden, by C. Bancroft Gillespie. And it was written late 19th century, but he's recording an oral history from members of the Hall family about Parson Hall, Theophilus Hall. And I'll just read it directly. As already noted, Parson Hall had 5 slaves, and a story has come down to the present day, which is without a doubt based on fact. In the days where the parish still worshipped in the little church on Meeting House Hill, the parson, by the way, parson just means the reverend or the churchman, was the owner of a slave who was surly and unruly, and whom it sometimes became necessary to chastise. One Sunday morning, the parson was obliged to whip this Negro, thence went to his duties at the church. Someone saw what looked like a fire at Mr. Hall's house, which could be seen from the church. So the congregation hastily adjourned, and on reaching the house, found that the surly Negro had set fire to a hayrick closely adjoining it. For a time, it looked as if the house would be destroyed, but by hard work it was saved. Short time later, the Negro climbed into a chestnut tree in the southern part of the farm, and falling broke his neck. So it's two forms of resistance. You have an unnamed enslaved man who attempted to burn down the home of his oppressor. And when that failed, rather than return to enslavement, he decided to commit suicide rather than spend another day enslaved by this man. So we really see from this oral history 2 forms of enslavement. And of course, an oral history from white individuals leaves out the name of the enslaved person, the time period, these details, and what we get mainly is the perspective of that Parson Hall. And I mentioned one case already of legal resistance, Rhoda Bristol, who was able to gain her and her children's freedom in the court. And this was a rare form of resistance, but it did work in some cases. Another one was in Wallingford in 1793 when 2 white men from Wallingford, John Ives III and Joel Moss, kidnapped the daughter of Peter Elke, a free Black man from Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Peter sued John and Joel, and it went to the New Haven courts. Peter was able to win not only the freedom of his daughter, but also was awarded $500 in damages. And again, as I'm going to continue to reiterate, we're only seeing some of these examples. There are far more. Yes.
In these court cases, the Rhoda's court case, were the people that kidnapped punished?
In Rhoda's case, they were not. They were not punished. By the time the lawsuit was finished, the initial person who had illegally kidnapped her had long died, and the people who had kidnapped her children were not punished. So this case they were, so I think it goes case by case. But oftentimes these were prominent men in the towns who might even have positions within the town government and have sway. But this story came through again from those newspaper sources. So one of the questions I got last time was this idea of, well, what's happening to the people who are running away? What's happening to the people who gain their freedom? Some of them, if it's gained legally, stay. Not really going to go. Most don't seem to go out of state. Maybe over time they do, but most seem to stick in the same area. But for those who had run away, it was probably a couple locations, whether it was a free Black community in the town. There were larger Black communities in Southern Connecticut, for example. There were also states that abolished slavery before Connecticut. Full abolition of slavery in Connecticut, as I mentioned, didn't happen until 1848, but Massachusetts fully abolished it in 1783, 65 years before Connecticut. And later on, it probably became more common to flee to Canada, but Canada did not, as part of England, did not abolish slavery until 1830. I don't remember the exact year, but the 1830s. I mentioned how enslaved people could join the Continental Army for freedom. That was not a countrywide or even colony-wide law. That was just agreements that many individuals took up. One such example is Noah Yale. His son was drafted into the Continental Army, and in this time period, you could send a replacement. And so Noah Yale sent Catham, his enslaved man. In the agreement he made with Catham was that if he served for a certain amount of time, Catham would gain his freedom. So he served in the Connecticut 4th Regiment for 3 years. He returned and gained his freedom, but his wife Maria did not. That was not part of the agreement. And this evidence comes from a pension record in 1818, but I was able to follow that up and find some land records as well. And for example, this is Catherine Freeman's family emancipation record. The next part of this story is that Catham gains his freedom, earns money, and is able to purchase the freedom of his family. So he agrees to work for Noah Yale for free for a certain number of years. And at the end of that term, his wife, Maria, and their child, Jube, would be freed. And I found that record in the Connecticut land record. So this is actually the record of the initial agreement, not the actual freeing, but I do have that one. And this was another common form of freedom, especially in this time period. But even after Catham gains freedom, he does not have the same rights as a white man in the town of Wallingford. He is not able to vote, although it is not to say no Black men in Wallingford were able to vote. There was actually 2 that we found evidence of, Jack John and Toby Birdseye, who were able to gain the right to vote. So in the late 18th century, you had to be a man and you had to own property. Those were the 2 rules that made it so that you would be allowed to vote. But even then, you had to be accepted by the town as a good standing citizen. So most Black men did not get that. And this is actually a newspaper article that was put out attempting to smear one of these 2 men, Toby Birdseye, into convincing people not to give him the right to vote. So they made up these accusations about him that he was, guilty of criminal assault. And the brief right to vote went away in 1818 with the Connecticut Constitution that added the stipulation that they had to be a white man to vote. So there's this brief time period after the American Revolution and between the Connecticut 1818 Constitution where it was possible in certain situations for a Black man to vote, but it was not, did not last long and did not return until the passing of the 14th Amendment. So once freed, the Freemans, now Catham takes up the last name Freeman. They do not leave, they stay in what would eventually become part of Meriden. They marry into other families. And I have, evidence here of his children marrying in with the Prinns and the Smiths and all of these different connected families. But without that family name, it's pretty much impossible to follow these families through time. For example, Sharp, who was enslaved by Deacon Benjamin Atwater, and Patience, who was enslaved by Ruth Merriman, were married and had the children, Chloe, Juba, Lemon, Lily, Rhoda, and Violet. But without that family name that they adopted, I have no way of knowing what happened to them or their descendants. One of the difficulties for Black families to follow up on their genealogy here in the United States is that lack of a family name. And even then, these early census records often only show the head of the households, not everyone who lived there. So when you look at this example of a family, the first one on there is David Johnson. We see that there's 6 people or 7 people in the house, but we only get the name of David Johnson. That doesn't really change till I think about 1840 or 1850. So at this point, it's been decades since these families have gained their freedom. And it's a long period to kind of close the gap. And this would include renters too. If they were renting a house or renting a room in a larger house, only the landlord's name would be on that census record. So looking at the 19th century, as I mentioned, the Black community in Wallingford continues to grow. And many of these free families grow not only in size, but connections to these other free families. And the population continues to grow as there are more and more enslaved people from the South who escaped slavery. One of these examples that some people here might be familiar with is a man named Tony Smith. Now, Tony Smith did not escape slavery in the South. He was a native of Connecticut. And he actually served in the famous 54th Massachusetts during the Civil War. So he was a veteran of that famous, was it Fort Wagner, if you ever seen the movie Glory. So he was wounded at that battle, but his wife, Amy Warner, she was the granddaughter of a man named Cato Warner. And Cato was enslaved in Wallingford by Major Edward Barker until 1795. So I use this to kind of conclude this story to see how these figures famous in Wallingford history up until the Civil War have these connections still till slavery in the 18th century in Wallingford. So that concludes, kind of brief glimpse into this history of Connecticut's, Wallingford's history of enslavement. There's my information, the website of our organization, my email, but I want to open it up for some questions.
Was owning slaves in Connecticut considered something more of the upper class before, or were they enslaved across classes?
You were enslaved across classes, but it was more common with the more money an individual had. So, prominent individuals, governors, politicians, reverends, large landowners, they were most likely to enslave people, but it was not exclusive to that.
Did you find any record of where the slaves lived? If they were on a big, mansion or house? Did they have their own slave quarters, or were they?
So the only record of slave quarters I was able to find was that the Oakdale Tavern, the initial person who lived at the Oakdale Tavern had slave quarters in the back of his house. But for the most part, with such low numbers, they would often sleep in the same house as the person who enslaved them, because it was often 1, 2, or 3 individuals in that home. It would really only be the larger enslavers who owned 8 to 10 individuals that would have a separate structure for them. And of course, those conditions were not great. Yeah.
Did you find any evidence of the Underground Railroad passing through here, or There was talk at a time that that tavern you mentioned was a source.
So it's not something I really looked into because I wanted to look at the enslaved history of Wallingford rather than its role in the Underground Railroad. I know Wallingford and really Connecticut in general has that role as it was a path towards Canada. But when you look at that time period, mainly the 18th century and early 19th century, the Underground Railroad's not really around yet because it's kind of just springs up informally. And really the abolitionists who really help along don't really start out until the 1830s. Yeah. So Catherine Freeman, there is actually a, someone put up a headstone to him in Meriden next to a graveyard. So he's buried, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I have the location, it's in Meriden. But his headstone was put up later on by people who followed his story by a veterans organization as he was a veteran of the American Revolution. You're welcome. Yeah. Yes, I'm looking to Lorraine over here as I live in Middletown, so I'll just pull it up so the one people know what I'm talking about. Yeah, the Theophilus Jones house. Yeah.
I think you mentioned that there were a number of enslaved persons from Rome who were buried in the Center Street Cemetery in unmarked graves.
Yep.
Do you know numbers? Do you know anything about locations? Is that knowledge anywhere in the cemetery?
So where it would work most times, whether free or enslaved or white or black, if they could not afford a headstone, they were usually a section of the graveyard that was given to people, even if they were just a poor white individual who could not afford a grave marker. They would be considered like a poor man's lot, and they were kind of just lumped in together. I don't know exactly where that was, but I don't think I know of any graveyard that I can think of off the top of my head, Wallingford, Cheshire, Meriden, anywhere that acknowledges that. Although I will say, when I did go to, as mentioned, there's the headstone to Catherine Freeman, so there is that slight acknowledgement in the Cheshire. One of the Cheshire graveyards I went to did have a list of a couple of the veterans who were buried there. So it seems some of the veteran organizations have done something. That's the only thing I've really seen.
Do you happen to know the identities of any other
Oh,
people who were buried in the cemetery?
probably close to 100. Yeah, it's really, you'd have to go through these land and church records and just count up the number. I could, if it's a church record from Wallingford, they were probably buried in the Center Street Cemetery. For most of that history, it was the only cemetery really around. Yes.
Thoughts on why that so late compared to the other northern states?
Yeah, so it was talked about even at that time. We were actually called the Georgia of the North for that very reason. Because Connecticut percentage-wise at one point has the largest percentage-wise population of enslaved people of any of the New England states. I think also the connection with the slave trade helped a lot because it's a similar story for Rhode Island. Rhode Island provided many of the ship captains for the slave trade. And I think because it was more ingrained in the economy in those ways, it was a little bit later. That's my best guess, to be honest, because there's so many factors that go into it, but it was acknowledged in that time period too.
Just wanted to point out that Catherine Freeman's headstone is at Broad Street Cemetery.
Thank you.
So it's right along the side.
Yeah, and they actually put it next to the cemetery, not in the cemetery. I don't know why. Is it more visibility or, but it's actually at the street side part of it because I went and visited it. Yeah.
I noticed as you were speaking, say enslaved person rather than slave, and enslaver rather than slave, on a very consistent. Is that intentional? What are you trying to convey?
Yeah, thanks for noticing. So the reason it has to do with what I talked about at the beginning, this idea that enslavement was a condition put upon the people rather than a title and an end-all be-all of their identity, that they were more than just slaves. They were more, because so oftentimes I'm an educator for my day job. And I see one of my coworkers here. And so oftentimes when kids and even adults talk about free Black people, they'll say, well, free slaves. And, you know, oftentimes they were never enslaved. And it becomes this equation between Black and slave that is not really comfortable and not really accurate. So again, try to emphasize the fact that this is a continuous condition being put upon a portion of the population.
With so many advertisements for runaway slaves, were there occasions when runaways went and were found by someone else and kept by that?
Oh, I'm sure. You know, there was that one I showed that was somebody had actually taken Jack and was looking for Nathaniel Curtis to return him. And I'm sure plenty of people did not return them. I'm sure that was quite common, especially with those other stories we have of Joseph Demink being kidnapped and Peter Elkley's daughter being kidnapped and Rhoda Bristol's children being kidnapped. It seems to be epidemic, really. And then, of course, you look at other history. If you ever seen 12 Years a Slave, you know, it seems to have been a continuous thing that was happening for not only the 18th, but the 19th century. So I'd be shocked if that didn't happen. The problem is finding the evidence of that, because being a crime, they don't want there to be evidence.
I mean, just one factor that are underlying economic reality was the slaves were very valuable and they were expensive. And even in the Articles of Confederation, there were fugitive slave laws, and that continued into the Constitution. There's a very strong point that slavery and the rights in that property be protected, both in the Articles of Confederation and later in our present Constitution. And so it was expensive, and these were big losses. And there were horse wrestlers and cattle wrestlers. This is another very expensive piece of property. It's interesting that people had to purchase the freedom, like Chatham had to work, you said, for no pay for a period of time to purchase the freedom to compensate the slave owner. So we talk about reparations today. It was the slave owners who were about reparations, not the enslaved people.
Yeah, and it wasn't unique to the United States either. England, when they abolished slavery in the 1830s, pays the enslavers, not the enslaved. And we, you know, I'm sure you've heard, you know, was it 2 acres and a mule or 3 acres and a mule, whatever the number was. There was this idea at the very beginning of this, you know, or the very end of the Civil War, that reparations should be paid out to enslaved people, and that didn't end up happening.
When Fred and Chaplain doing research on Native Americans for the Linear Trail kiosk, we learned that some Native individuals northward and intermarried with Black individuals who may have included runaway slaves. Do you find any evidence of that?
So one of the difficulties with that, you know, one of these ads says mulatto slave. That just means biracial. They don't say what the other race is. You know, for all I know, it could be half Native American, half Black. They could be 90% Native American and 10% white. We don't really know. But oftentimes the records would lump Black and Native American people together. Many of the census records, for example, that 1762 record I gave of 151, you know, Black people in Wallingford included the Native American population. But looking at the previous one, there was only like 20 listed. Native American people listed, so it wasn't a large portion. I did not find direct evidence of that, but you know, one of the people we talked about, Rhoda Bristol, was a Native American, so her children were part Native American, and her husband was Black. Dick Bristol was a Black man, so there is that example there. and her children are illegally enslaved. Yes.
Black Balls. I understand that he was a slave of Elihu Curtis.
Yeah, so-
American Revolution gained his freedom. Was that true?
Yeah, so I have records of over 400 individuals. I recognize that name. Yeah, and so I don't have everyone's story memorized, but I do recognize the name. And I would say of the over 400 data points, there were at least a dozen individuals who were, veterans of the American Revolution. And a lot of them gained their freedom in that way, like Dick Bristol, like Catherine Freeman. You're welcome. Any other questions? Yes.
Can I ask a question about arson, slave, starting a fire?
Mhm.
The question is, at the very end, you say you committed suicide. I kind of skimmed down to that and thought, oh my God. And I'm just wondering about your interpretation. Were there examples of punishment meted out to runaway slaves that involved?
So, yeah, there is the possibility that this was a lynching rather than a suicide. But my personal interpretation is a suicide because of it being a form of resistance. When you look at the history of slavery and the slave trade, suicide was one of the most common methods of resistance. Slave ships themselves would have nets on the side of them because so many of the kidnapped Africans would attempt to jump overboard rather than continue to be an enslaved person. Now, one of the organizations I follow, Brian Stevenson's organization, the Equal Justice Initiative, has a database of lynchings. And I think they found lynchings of Black individuals in almost every state. Last I checked, Connecticut was not one of them. Now, that's not to say it didn't happen. As I've kind of talked about throughout, we only have a portion of these records. Whippings would be the most common way, and you can see it in this case as well, a common punishment. And even some of the runaway slave ads give example of body markings on the back, whipping marks of individuals who were punished, whether for escape or resistance and in some other form. But I have not personally uncovered any history of lynching, but again, that does not mean it doesn't exist.
So lynching becomes prominent during the Jim Crow era when slaves were legally free. And it was a method used, statement, by the former slave owners to maintain racial domination and to use the terror that the lynching conspired to keep the Black population of the South subservient, even though under the Constitution they were technically legally free.
Yeah, and Connecticut wasn't immune to those sort of Jim Crow rules. We don't, talk about it a lot, but the beaches were segregated in Connecticut. I know it gets a little bit beyond what I'm talking about here, but also there were sundown towns in Connecticut. So this history, what I'm talking about is just one point of the history that connects to other. And maybe one day we'll do a project that continues that story, picks it up from 1848 to look at, see how that history of enslavement impacted Wallingford's history in the later centuries. Someone else had their hand up. Yes.
Did you come across any records of anybody being prosecuted for aiding and abetting in the state?
I did not, although, well, that's not completely true, because with that case of Rhoda Bristol, I mentioned that, I'm trying to find the exact slide. With Rhoda Bristol, those three Black men, Philip, Joseph Prynne, and Jack, they rescued her children, but they had done that before the lawsuit had concluded. So they were punished for rescuing Rhoda Bristol's children. So that is one example of that happening. And I believe it was whippings. Yes.
Kenny asked about Oakdale Tavern, where slaves kept in separate house, in a separate house behind the tavern or in the tavern itself. I knew there was a bar located on the other side of the Hartford Turnpike during the.
So it was a separate structure, and I remember the evidence I got from that. It was a newspaper article from the 1950s of a town historian who mentions that at the time, in the 1950s, the Oakdale Tavern is still there. Mentions that the structures behind the Oakdale Tavern were slave quarters. So there were, and he mentions it in a plural. So it, from that context, that there's more than one.
That it might be interesting just to mention what is at the Nehemiah Royce House, Freedom's Powder Horn, and have a mural from the Oakdale.
Yep. Yeah, so Lorraine here is part of the Wallingford Historic Preservation Trust. So some of what you've seen here will be elaborated on more with that exhibit at the Royce House here in Wallingford, with certain pieces, artifacts, Dick Freedom's powder horn. He was not one of the people I mentioned here, but there was a mural depicting enslavement in the 18th century that will be on display as part of the exhibit. Artifacts, Caleb Atwater's chest, for example. So yeah, there will be more information than I gave here as part of that exhibit.
My question is, if you have the number of names of people that were enslaved, is there, and who may be buried in the, is there any conversation of a plaque or something that does bring those names to life?
So
My second question has to you along the same line. Are you aware of the witness stone project that is ran for
we're putting a witness stone at the Royce House as part of the June 19th opening of the exhibit.
No, I'm not. I work at a school in New Haven, and they're on their second year of.
Yeah. So we're hoping to build this. We'll be putting up an exhibit to Dick Freedom at the Royce House as part of the opening of the exhibit. I know we've connected the Witness Stones project with a number of other organizations. St. Paul's is going to do their own. We've connected them with other organizations in town. I believe Choate we've connected them with. There's going to be a workshop here next month done by Dennis of the Witness Stones project in collaboration with this. So we're hoping that more organizations will pick up on that, not just here in Wallingford.
There was a Negro by the name of Cook who was killed during the British invasion in the Hague in 1779. Was he from Wallingford? I'm doing research on him. I think he was from North Branford. I wasn't sure.
The name doesn't sound familiar, but I can pull up my list to see if there's anyone with a similar name on there. So there's two. The Atwater College I showed was his general store. It's on the Choate campus currently. And there's the Atwater Homestead, and right next to it. Yeah, and there's far more than that connected. The buildings that were either housing enslavers and enslaved people, potentially built by those individuals. There's more than what I just showed. Yes.
I just want to say how much I appreciate the project that the Wallingford Preservation Trust took on. It's very important and so gratified and also library as well. In opening up our history to the real history of the country. Very commendable, really much appreciated.
I appreciate that. And one interesting thing that happened the last time I gave this in November, one of the women in the audience, Carol Naiman, saw the name on here and was unaware of that history. So we worked with her, and it's going to be part of the exhibit. She's going to be there when the exhibit opens, and we worked with her to get an idea of her lineage, exactly how that name and connection was made. And I was able to trace it back to two individuals from Wallingford that were enslaved in the town and moved to that Southington community I briefly mentioned before, the Birches, until her alive here today in Meriden. And she taught as a school teacher in Wallingford for, I think it was like 20 something years. So that was a great thing that we were able to do. And I was so glad I was able to connect with Carol when we did this last in November. Well, I want to thank you all so much for coming out.